Hola amigos, bien o no, saludos desde Medellín. El tema de hoy, yo quiero mostrar a ustedes algo que este tipo de libro, que honestamente yo no utilicé este tipo de libro mucho en mis clases, pero también es útil para entender distintos niveles para la estudiante pueda progresar y mejorar poco a poco. Por ejemplo, para este tipo de examen en inglés hay casi 9 puntos, 9 distintos niveles. Uno es no entender nada con la lengua y 9 es casi fluido, como nativo. Este libro es un número 6. Número 6 es como dice una persona que tiene una buena competencia en la lengua. So if you are like a number 6 on this list, you would be listed as what's called a competent user. Tiene una buena competencia. You can generally understand the language, maybe make a few mistakes, but you can use it, understand quite complicated things, especially in familiar situations. So things that you're practice talking about, you'd be able to talk about in a quite complex way, but maybe some situations you'd be a bit lost and you'd need more words. So sometimes these books are useful for me to look at the level of language that's appropriate for different students, because clearly everyone has a different kind of entry level ability in the language to help them improve it. So for me, I find these books are useful for that. I don't use them much else beyond that. Some people just teach straight from these books. Personally, I don't, but that's a matter of taste. What I'm going to show you today, just to give you something else to have a listen to, I'm going to read something else from this book. Now remember, this is aimed at a competent user, someone who has a generally effective command of the language despite some inaccuracies, inappropriacies, like mistakes, and misunderstandings. Someone who can use and understand fairly complex language, particularly in familiar situations. So really an intermediate to advanced level student. Yeah. So I'm going to read a little bit from one of the test readings they have at the back of the book here. There's quite a few. I'm just going to read a bit of that. Have a listen, see how much you understand. To give you some context, this part of the reading is talking about the history of my hometown, London, but not as you see it there. Have a listen, see how much you understand. In the 11th century, in 1066 to be precise, the Normans conquered England, and during the next few centuries, London became one of the most powerful and prosperous cities in Europe. The East End benefited from this, and because there were fewer restrictions there than in the city itself, plenty of newcomers settled there from abroad, bringing their skills as workers, merchants or moneylenders during the next few hundred years. In the 16th century, the first dock was dug where ships were constructed, eventually making the East End the focus of massive international trade. And in the late 16th century, when much of the rest of England was suffering economically, a lot of agricultural workers came to the East End to look for alternative work. In the 17th century, the East End was still a series of separate semi-rural settlements, and there was a shortage of accommodation, so marshland was drained and built on to house the large numbers of people now living there. By the 19th century, London was the busiest port in the world, and this became the main source of employment in the East End. Those who could afford to live in more pleasant surroundings moved out, and the area became one when the vast majority of people lived in extreme poverty and suffered from appalling sanitary conditions. So there we are. That's a little bit a standard reading from this type of text. These particular exams, the IELTS exams, these are mainly aimed at people that are looking to study at university. So a lot of the content in these books is to do with reading and writing practice. But again, if you have something like this in your library, you find, practice it for the reading, because you know that the level of the book, the vocabulary you're seeing there is at quite an advanced level, and if you can cope with reading that fairly well, that's a good sign. So what we were talking about here is the East End of London, which, strangely enough, is more or less this part here you see in the picture, which has changed a great deal since the 11th century we were talking about there. Okay, well, I hope you found this one interesting today. This is just to show you different ways you can use even these type of text. Perhaps it wouldn't be the one you were looking for to study yourself, because perhaps this is teaching you something you don't necessarily need to focus on. An example, this would be more for people who are trying to study for university. But even if you're not particularly worried about a high level of writing or reading fluency, particularly writing correctly and punctuation, that's not the main thing you need to get better at the moment. Just using it as a tool to help you with your reading, show that you can read and understand language at a higher complex level, still fairly useful. There we go, that's our thought for the day. So again, déjeme saber en los comentarios, como siempre. I'm from Medellin and a little bit from modern London. We'll say cheerio.